Hi and welcome to the August product update from MobileCaddy. Just a quick introduction. Myself, Justin. I'm joined with Paul, our CTO, Todd, our mobile chief technical architect, and Frank, our lead product engineer. As of last month, again, we picked out a number of updates from the releases that have been coming thick and fast. From the last month, and so we're going to run through a number of those. But if we want to dig into any more detail, the release notes are on our developer site, along with more detail, as well as a number of items that maybe we won't get to cover today. So to start with, we've got a number of new documentation items come out. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of those. To start with, Frank, we've got a couple of documentation items that have been really helpful, particularly around the container apps and connected apps. I wonder if we could just touch on the two items that we've added recently on that side.
Hey Justin, yeah, that's right. So now we have a new connected app user guide. It's really easy to follow. Helps you set up your connected apps for iOS and Android on your organization. Lists all the settings that you need, everything that should be on and off, what you need to fill in. So yeah, really easy to follow. Nice guide to have. And the second update that we have is an update to our container app requirements sheet. Just a couple of things. First is an increase in the resolution required for the splash screen. So I think this is to cater for these new high resolution devices like the 12-inch iPad Pro, massive device. And a second item, which is that Apple and Google require access to the application for review. So now we're asking for a user account to be set up with access to the application so they can go through the review process pretty smoothly. So that's those two, I think.
Thanks, Frank. Yeah, really interesting. So both of those really, when people are having their customized container apps now, most likely you'll want a connected app for each of those for iOS, Android, Windows, etc. And also, as Frank's noting, there's newer devices come out. So that's up. Those types of documentation are updated not too regularly, but they do happen as particularly Apple change their requirements. And then Todd, we've got a number of items. I think you picked a couple of three here from a documentation perspective, from looking at the development flow particularly, and some help around there. Maybe you can cover a couple of those.
Yeah, sure, certainly can do. As you said, yeah, I've picked out three items here from the documentation releases since the last call. These were really it came from requests from the partner developers that we had in. So one of the key things which was nice to get queried about was really the unit testing and how our unit testing framework is set up. So what we've done is put together a guide in the development site that allows people to see how we go ahead with our testing, and some examples of how developers might want to mock out some of the services, so the MobileCaddy libraries in particular, which helps them get good code coverage in there, as well as some principles on how to take the unit test coverage forwards. We include in there some information about how they can add this into their continuous deployment, so how they can set up pipelines on Bitbucket, for example, to make sure that any changes they get, they're still passing all of the tests and they're aware of this. That's a real fond part of ours in MobileCaddy, the testing side. So yeah, really pleased to have queries on that. One of the painful points that we get asked about a lot is handling time zones in MobileCaddy. This actually is a topic really bigger than MobileCaddy. It's more about how JavaScript and HTML and browsers handle time zones. And one of the things that is a gotcha, I think, for a lot of developers is that the browsers and JavaScript default to users' local time for creating timestamps, etc. Obviously, when you're dealing with a centralized data store in terms of Salesforce that's storing all dates and times in UTC, developers can very quickly find themselves an hour, 2 hours, or more out, and that's even without beginning to think about daylight savings. So we put a guide together for that, which I think will hopefully be very useful and kind of black magicifying the time zones and dates and times and things. The last item I think that's really worth mentioning in terms of the documentation release from the development side is following on, I think, something that we've had an increased demand for really is community apps and community users, and being able then to run applications up as a community profile from within CodeFlow and also on the platform emulator. So we've put together a guide there that should aid developers and testers being able to run the apps up with those particular profiles, which is something kind of new to us, but it seems to be working really well. So those are key points from our side, I think there.
Yeah, that's great. And I think just on that last item you mentioned, as you say, obviously there's a lot of applications utilizing the community licenses, whether that be customer or partner, and the variants of those licenses, and as an employee one as well. But if a developer would be now using CodeFlow, of course, they're running in as a sysadmin, most likely to actually build and deploy the application. Here they can run another browser logged in and actually have that sort of profile permission sets running as well, Todd. That's the key there, isn't it, on CodeFlow?
Yes, it is. Yeah, so I think it enables a further level of sanity checking from the developer's point of view to make sure that not just is their application code up to scratch, but you're starting to flex the platform configuration too. So you're highlighting problems that might usually have only ended up being highlighted or leveraged when you made aware of once you're running on a device. So it's catching those things earlier, which is good.
Yeah, and the sister to that, as everyone on the call, our side here understands, but the platform emulator, which is this ability to run an application prior to deploying to a device from the platform, now starting to increase the ability to run that, not just as a community user, but although we specifically called it out here, but as any profile on the platform. And again, giving that first sort of smoke test of the application, not just now from a deployment perspective, but as Todd was mentioning there, from sort of profiles and permissions, which, as we all know, Salesforce, can be pretty complex there if you've got a decent profile and permission setup. All sounding really good. And above all of that, we've got a big push on documentation generally, which I'm sure we'll be updating as we go through these update calls. Thanks very much, Frank, Todd. Both of those, or both Frank and Todd's documents, can be found at developer.mobilecaddy.net. And so we're moving on now back to the platform. And Paul, something you mentioned the last update was around increased support for a range of Salesforce standard objects. Maybe give us an update of where we are on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, thank you. Thanks, Justin. And welcome to everyone listening. What we actually have achieved with MobileCaddy is significant, but it's been based primarily on custom objects. In the early days, that's what we basically worked around and achieved a larger number of successful applications based on them. But the demand has been there for potential, initially the big four, the account, contact, lead, and opportunities standard objects. The way we implement them in MobileCaddy is initially it's for the developers out there, MobileCaddy devs, you would have potentially mobilized tables, and you'll see that the standard objects aren't offered, and that's because under the bonnet of MobileCaddy, we have to be able to recognize the metadata of specific fields, and that metadata in turn drives the whole code process for the synchronization, the checking, also code down on the device, has to fully understand the underlying metadata. Now, the standard objects have varying different types of metadata that differ hugely from the custom objects. Like, for example, case doesn't have a name field, it's got a case number field. Account and lead have got a number of employees field, which isn't a number, not a standard number, it's a strange 7-digit long integer, and the list goes on and on and on. So what we've had to do is in turn take these the standard objects that we wish to make available to our customers, and to analyze the metadata and to change the whole code base to deal with the definition. And the definition of the metadata is plugged in. We call them MobileCaddy components. When you upgrade MobileCaddy, you may have been asked to upgrade those. They come inside a document, and they're plugged in, and they then define fully what the individual fields do. So we've been able to release this month, just in the case object, the account, contact, leads and opportunities, which were partially released, are now fully available. And in addition to that, we've put in the activities, i.e. events and tasks, and the kind of the product price book suite, which is like your product object, your price book, and your price book entry. So we're very excited to make those available. Obviously, we'll continue to look through the list of standard objects and work on those in the future. But the headline for standard objects this month is that specific set.
Yeah, it's really helpful, and I think, as we said before, the release notes will contain more detail. But Paul, basically from an impact point, I assume the org or the sandbox and so forth there'd be some sort of upgrade process, and then the actual process themselves and getting those tables, is that just then the same as I would have done previously with custom and the other standard objects we already had in?
Yes, basically, if you went to mobilize a table in a current upgraded, so before version 1.10 of MobileCaddy, and you entered, for example, case in the search box, it wouldn't be available. You wouldn't see it come up. Now what will happen is you'll upgrade MobileCaddy. We have some validation that we've added. So you might, if you go to mobilize an object, you may be asked to actually upgrade or run in your new MobileCaddy components at that point if you're doing an upgrade process. And once you've done that, then the objects will become available. Now these are only, I must say, on there when you're using our Sync 4, which is our paging engine, the latest synchronization process. If you're using a prior version, we recommend you upgrade to Sync 4, and then upgrade your dynamic version. You need Sync 4, and then there's a column set version which will appear if you're a MobileCaddy user, and you've upgraded before a DV to use a different synchronization engine. There's a button there for upgrading, and it will offer you something called column set 4, which contains all of these new objects. So basically, you upgrade the MobileCaddy, you upgrade the MobileCaddy components, new DV, take yourself up to Sync 4, column set 4, and all of these standard objects will become available to you.
Yes, that's excellent. And I think it actually gives a little bit of color around exactly what we mean by versioning and component versioning and dynamic versions. This is this idea that you could have an application running now, and that's got a version, and these upgrades will not affect any of your previous versions or your applications. In other words, you can really select down and be quite targeted about when you want these new capabilities. And this, we're talking about the sync and the objects here, but it could be anything. So although we think of an application as in components of versions within your application that you're building, this also allows us, the same architecture allows us to switch out and switch up to new and better, or maybe more feature-rich components within MobileCaddy, but still allow your previous versions, your previous applications to run using the older components from MobileCaddy. So Paul's really good milestone. So it's really good to hear. I think in the same way, thinking about sort of speed, of mobilizing tables and standard objects, I'm going to switch over to chat with Todd and really about some of the elements that have been added into the starter apps that you've been working on, or the team's been working on the last month or so. Todd, maybe I can push over to you if that's okay.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, so we've had some nice updates actually in the starter apps. So these for those who don't know, the applications you can begin building your own projects off of. We offer various kind of flavors of those out, and we're continually trying to maintain and bring in the best practices that we pulled in from elsewhere into these as good bases for your code. The key areas I think that we've been looking at bringing in over the past weeks has been to improve some of the diagnostics and recovery areas that we have. So it's very rare that you get into a state where records or your app isn't working quite as you expect it to. So we've added some a diagnostic screen into the application now. So this is in the Shell app in your settings area. And as a developer, you can still style this however you want or hide it away into other areas, but the basis is for developers to build on. And the diagnostics area allows us to test things like the heartbeat. So that's the layers underneath is checking that the OAuth is still working, access tokens, etc., are still running fine, and the ability to view some of the latest mobile log records without having to sync them back to the platform and asking an administrator to see what's going on. So that's really handy, and that's proven very useful in our early day POCs that are going out at the moment. We've also improved the recovery mechanism for tables. This now allows the user to specify on a table by table basis, or which tables they might want to push up to the platform in the case where they're trying to debug a problem. And along with that, actually, we finally got rid of our default password that was currently in the settings area to view things like the mobile table inspector and other development tools. So we've removed that now and replaced it with a sort of a two-factor authentication type approach that involves actually contacting your admin to get a PIN code to unlock the app to get into that area. Obviously, that's not required when you're in development phase, so we've removed that for when you're running the application in CodeFlow, which should hopefully be kind of give our partners some more confidence in that. In terms of rolling these things out, they're already in our existing Shell and Starter apps at the moment, and we'll be kind of going through contacting partners and clients to help them include these changes into their projects as well. So yeah, some really good steps in that side, and I think we'll just see that that continuing to grow actually.
That's excellent, and I think the diagnostics, particularly, one of the things I hear all the time from all elements of the project, the app project, there, be it from dev or test or even into production, is one, being able to visualize things, see things that traditionally are not visible. That of course goes into things like the connection sessions and logs, but also to understand how your application is doing. And even if you don't have something that's causing an issue, potentially you're running through some various scenarios like permissions and data and restrictions. So the more detail we have here within those starter apps and what you get straight out the box, of course, meaning zero effort in that sense. That's that's excellent.
Yeah.
Maybe just to reiterate, so the PIN recovery would be pretty much as Frank was describing last month on the recovery on the app side, local recovery rather than in-app or platform recovery, should I say. And so I think there is an alignment here to make sure that the package that we're running is up to the latest to have that PIN recovery two-factor side available. That's correct, yeah?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Brilliant.
Lovely. Okay, fantastic. And I've actually seen that myself, and it is, it's really quite impressive. So moving on and to thinking about things that we record, making things easier, giving visibility and so on. Paul, a lot of the work we do around creating that visibility is using several objects and lists of records, therefore, on the platform itself. And you've been looking a bit more in detail around how some of those things are stored and what we work with. Do you fancy taking some time through the metrics and the logs, etc., on the platform side?
Love to, yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Justin. Yeah, I would. I think many of our customers, developers, and so on have seen these records. We store records called connection sessions, and hanging off them, our mobile logs, and if anyone's ever had an issue when they're building an app and they've forgotten to do something correctly and a Salesforce error occurs, they would have already been in there, and they can view the connection sessions and they can see what's happening, what errors they've made, and how they can correct them. And of course, when your app is in production and it's running along nicely, you may wish to go in and examine these to see if, for example, an administrator could add a required field to a live Salesforce instance and break your app. And of course, these connection sessions will record that fact, and you'll be able to go in and see exactly what's going on. So they're extremely useful records, the connection sessions and the logs. And of course, the MobileCaddy metrics, which show really how we're performing against the governor limits and allow you to do some tuning to your app, particularly on the paging sync 4 that I mentioned earlier. So all of these records are extremely useful, but they have a lifetime. I mean, who really needs to look at a mobile log error from a year ago? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But what we find with our customers is that the Salesforce storage creeps up, it fills up. And so what we've had built into MobileCaddy for a few releases now is the automatic cleanup process. A MobileCaddy administrator can go to a mobile application record, and they can specify things like the number of times a cleanup should run a day, what the maximum number of connection sessions, logs and metrics stored should be. All of that is already there. But what we found from some of our customers is that as that runs automatically on a synchronization, if a synchronization hasn't occurred for a while, maybe your users are offline, or maybe it's an app that they'll only sync up with weekly or monthly, the administrator may wish to run that cleanup process. So we've given them a run cleanup button on the mobile application, and what that will do, it will look at the provisioning records, the application users in particular, and it will fire off efficient batch processes targeted at clearing down the connection sessions, logs and metrics, adhering to the parameters that I mentioned before. So it'll scan through the provisioning records of the users. It'll warn you, it'll tell you exactly how many processes it's going to run in case that's a concern. And once you click OK, it will all run neatly in background and clear down for you. And yeah, that's basically where we stand at the moment, Justin.
Yes, excellent. I think the other use case there, which is very common, isn't it, I suppose, is when you've got sandboxes and maybe your users aren't connecting because you're developing or configuring, and so that's another kick point that we could use within the sandbox environments, Paul.
Yes, absolutely. You find it there are different approaches on sandboxes to production, but you're absolutely right. That's a kick point. It's quite common.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Yeah, especially where you're only looking at smaller data volumes in sandboxes, particularly the partial sandboxes. No, that's great. Sort of skipping subjects now onto some elements around performance. And this is really two-sided to Frank and to Todd. So we'll start with Frank. There was some performance testing been happening, Frank, around startups, initial startups, restarts, and so on. I wonder if you give us a bit of a detail on one of the items we found, and then hopefully Todd can give us what we've implemented beyond that once your findings were found.
Cool. Yeah, no worries. So what we do is we periodically test the performance of the whole, MobileCaddy system, container apps to the platform. And one of the things we found was that on low connections, so that could be weak connections with high packet loss or low signal strength, that sort of thing, we are finding that the startup of the applications was unnecessarily long compared to if you were online, that would be fast, and even offline, that would be faster than if you were on a weak connection. So I guess if we drill down a bit, on the initial start of your application, we'll cache all your resources and assets and everything, so that you have all that availability offline, but that isn't necessarily needed to be checked again on a lower connection or offline. And what was happening was, on a low connection, that process would actually take quite a long time and slow your entry into the application. So once that was found, we then, implemented some fixes. I guess I'll hand you over to Todd to talk about those fixes, but that was quite a welcome fix for startups when you're out in the field or somewhere where you don't have too good a connection.
Great, thanks, Frank. Yeah, so we really pinpointed a startup after install where we're on that very low connection that's just hanging on there. Todd, I think there's a name banded around for that. If I pass over, maybe you can give us a bit of detail then in terms of what's been added and how everyone can get hold of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been calling it Li-Fi, and I think actually the name didn't come from us. We can't take credit for it, but it's or one of the scenarios is Li-Fi, where you might even be on a good connection, a really good connection, but perhaps you're sitting on a VPN somewhere that's not letting any other onward traffic. And so what we've done essentially in the utility libraries is identify these scenarios and just skip a couple of the pieces of processing that we would normally do when you're on that patchy connectivity. We could still run them, but we're not holding up any of the application startup in this case. And as Frank said, it was quite funny because we were quite intent on looking at the online and offline scenarios, and performance-wise they were excellent, and we came across this sort of patchy connectivity situation and identified that as causing us problems. So we've just implemented that within the MobileCaddy utility libraries. That's available to upgrade to. We have some unmanaged packages for those, and instructions all on our developer site too. I think we're currently pushing this out to our partners as well at the moment, so not just waiting for them to read the release notes, but actively contacting them to let them know that these updates are there. Code-wise, it was a relatively small change to implement, but actually I think in the hands of the users it will certainly be noticeable for sure. So it's a really good find.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Todd. Thanks, Frank. Yeah, and I think on that, one of the things we're actively working on, just aside the product updates, is being able to identify when these patches and fixes are required within the project phase you're on, and also just to give that extra guidance of how to do that. And the documentation is very strong now around there, and also the addition now of this unmanaged package link to allow really quick access to these resources to add to your platform. And then from CodeFlow, a very simple set of instructions to bump those up too. So really just, again, making sure the aim really is to keep everyone working with the best of the best without adding any friction into the project time. So yeah, really appreciated. Paul, one of the things that comes up quite a lot is about data restriction. So we're sort of switching gears again here. And there's a number of things that we do for data restriction, but there's also a link into checking things on the platform. So we are always been pretty paranoid about both the running application and the migration of applications between environments. And I think you've got a little bit of extra information around how these two have both been increased to allow more features.
Yeah, thank you. You've handed me two big topics in one go there, Justin. Okay, so you're absolutely right. We've if we look at the restriction, I suppose it's the easiest one to explain. Is in many of our customers, they would on a mobile table, they'll add a basic restriction. We'll stick to that for now. And in the past, we've had the option of a user ID location, and so you could choose to only bring down records owned by the current user, for example, by choosing the owner ID, and similarly for the created by ID, or even any other user ID lookup field that you may add yourself. Now, what we did recently, we expanded that to give ourselves some more kind of elaborate possibilities, really to give us more functionality in the basic refresh type. So, before somebody has to write a platform class. So what we did is we allowed the creation of a formula field on the record that you're working on at the moment. And that formula field, it must resolve obviously to a Salesforce ID, but it does allow you to put in some quite complex logic using the Salesforce formula syntax, and achieve some quite intricate restrictions. I'm sure, Justin, you might, when I finish this piece, you might be able to give some examples. I believe you've actually used it in the real world. But if I just dovetail into the metadata checker, what we've had to do, as well as add this functionality to your mobile table, is we've had to change the dynamic version metadata checker. There's a button on dynamic versions called check metadata, and I mean, it's used at various reasons. I mean, if you're a developer and you think the DV is ready to go, ready to send over to a production org or another sandbox further down the chain, you might hit this button just to check that there aren't any issues or errors or problems with your dynamic version. You might habitually, as you're developing, click the button just to check things. It does some under the bonnet. The metadata checker, it will check things such as, does your start page exist? Does the cache manifest page exist? It'll even look at your app data version record and go down drill into those mobile tables and look to make sure that the referenced classes are all present. There's a whole host of validation in there. And what I've done now, of course, is I've extended it to allow for the validation of these new formula fields that I just mentioned. So really, those two dovetail nicely together, and those owner lookup formula fields are now available. I'll pass back to you, Justin. Maybe you can let us know how you've actually seen us implemented.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting actually around the ownership, because it's a classic sort of thing where you want to restrict. For example, if you've got engineers, they may have jobs, and the ownership of the job may well be to the engineer, which drives the data restriction. Of course, you don't want all the data coming down for all the engineers on every device. So part of our Moore's design view of the world in terms of mobile is to be very efficient with data. But there could easily be some stock items, for example, that are allocated against the job, and they may well be created by internal users. And so the ownership there would have been, for example, if I was the engineer, I'd own the parent job, but I most likely wouldn't own the stock items that have been allocated. For this type of feature, then what I can do is I can actually use a formula field to push the owner field from the job down into this child stock item, and then use that formula field within the restriction, so that with very limited effort, then I'm basically restricting me as the engineer to have my jobs, and naturally I'll also get all the stock items against the job. So very easy, very quick, and really actually drives a lot of power. And as Paul was saying there with the metadata checker, and we're not giving it its full value really, but there's absolute key points in the project lifecycle and the app distribution, or sort of say app migration points, where we want to check that the environment is in the same order as the environment I left in terms of export and import. And the metadata checker really goes top to bottom and checks that, and I know this is one that the partners particularly like when you're under project pressure, really just to give you that comfort of moving through different environments. So one very powerful feature and restriction, and then really an enhancement to that sort of paranoid let's check everything before we move across into any sort of UAT or production users. So really helpful. Again, I seem to be switching gears a lot, but I suppose we've covered just a big amount of ground in the last month. But moving on now, again, actually back to sort of a community view. One of the areas that communities are growing is this use of both a B2B and B2B2C and B2C, which means that our users are often coming into an environment where they don't want to hit the platform. They're a mobile first user and they don't have a community login, and they want to register. And so we've done a lot of work around self-registration in directly from the mobile app. Frank, in the sense of the container apps, these would be branded apps. So this is on my community branded app. There's a full implementation of that now. Maybe you could just give us a little bit of a flavour, and then Paul, I might ask you just to give us a feel for how complex that would have been compared to how we are now.
Yeah, that's right. So as you know, currently, usually you need a user set up so they can come in and log into their branded app and get to the application that they've been assigned. But in some cases, this is not what you want. That's not the type of user or the genre of user that you're caring to. So now we have this self-registration flow for community users, and under the covers, all the OAuth 2 authentication or the URL routing, that's all handled. So you can launch your application, enter all your users' details, and the user will be created and then taken to the application with all the authentication and everything handled for you. So obviously that allows you to cater to totally different users, people that's coming in that you've never seen before, that sort of thing. It's quite a nice flow. But yeah, I think it'll be great if Paul could cover all the technicalities there. That would be quite interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. So certainly from the platform side, it used to be the case you had to create the user, and if you set up a community, that in itself is error prone. You create the user, you make sure they've got the right profile, you make sure that that's all correctly set up inside the community. Whereas what we've got here is a platform side custom login page, self-registration page, and controller. So at MobileCaddy, we've worked on the existing ones that were present and dovetailed it in. We've also using sharing sets, been able to configure a community so that a user logs in and can't see all of the other contacts in there either. So we've got the security model licked as well, I think, Justin. So yeah, the user can, as Frank said, go to the device, hit the registration link instead of just signing in as they normally would. They hit a special link. They can then enter all of their details. It comes through to that custom controller on the back end. They're all registered, created, and the app actually gets redirected to, so they're immediately running the application. And if you go in, if an administrator goes in, you can see the users nicely created, all the security set up and ready to rock. So without even ever having signed directly into Salesforce on a browser. So we're quite impressed with that, Justin.
No, it's really, yeah, and another really strong piece, I think, here, because it opens up the door for these mobile first communities. And there are definitely communities where there is a mixed usage. We're seeing a growing, particularly as the community product itself, or the community cloud from Salesforce grows up. A lot of these settings can be seen quite daunting on the back end of the platform, all the things that you can set up and configure. But having now a sort of standard practice in terms of a custom login page, a self-reg page, all these things set up, and now the container apps to handle that. This really does, as Frank mentioned, open up the door for these different types of communities to be handled. So yeah, definitely a really wide-ranging selection of items we picked out from the releases there. We will be looking at doing a similar sort of update and roadmaps as well going forward, which may be more singular focus, but looking at items that we're currently beavering away on. But for this update, that about wraps it up. I'd like to say thanks for everyone who's joining and listening after the recording, and of course to Paul, Todd, and Frank. We're always open for new ideas and requests, particularly if you're pushing the product hard, as many of you are. So please feel free to contact us by any of the means. We have a info@mobilecaddy.net as an email to contact us on. Plus, you'll find us on most of the social channels. So we look forward to hearing you, and also another update next month. Thanks very much.